groan of the equalization valve was the sound of a lung gasping its first breath after a drowning. It was a lie, of course. He was ascending from the pure, sterile dark into a world that was suffocating in its own filth. The air that hissed into the cockpit of the Nereus carried the first taint of it, the metallic tang of ozone, the recycled dampness of the docking bay, and underneath it all, the faint, cloying sweetness of too many people breathing the same air for too long. His suit seals, still slick with the icy brine of the abyss, felt like a second, colder skin. He peeled the helmet from his head, the release a jarring pop in the pressurized cabin. The air, thin and synthetic as it was, rushed over his sweat-soaked hair and felt like a violation. He'd spent 36 hours in the crushing embrace of the Pacific's Mariana Zone, a place where the physics of the surface world became a cruel joke. Down there, silence was a physical presence, a pressure on the eardrums that was more profound than any sound. The only light was the cold, sterile beam of his own lamps, cutting a pathetic swath through an infinite, liquid night. It was a place of ghosts, of sunken histories and forgotten wars. It was clean. Now, the rising cacophony outside the viewport was a physical assault. The clang of mag clamps on steel, the whine of cargo drones, the distant, unintelligible bark of a docking marshal over a distorted pay system. It all blended into a single, grinding note of industrial misery. The final shudder of the Nereus settling into its cradle sent a vibration up his spine. Home. The word was a bitter ash in his mouth. This wasn't home. It was a mooring, a place to refuel and resupply before the next descent into the only peace he ever knew. The hatch unlocked with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a final, weary sigh. He pushed it open, the humid bay air washing over him, thick and heavy. It smelled of scorched metal and hydraulic fluid, an industrial perfume that clung to the inside of his nostrils. He swung his legs out, his boots hitting the grated deck with a heavy thud. Every muscle ached with the peculiar soreness that came from being compressed and then decompressed. A human accordion, played by the indifferent hand of the ocean. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man whose body was a tool he could no longer afford to break. The bay was a cavern of pitted ferrocrete and rust-streaked steel, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium lamps. Drones buzzed overhead like carrion birds, their manipulator arms swiping at cargo containers. Around him, other salvagers gaunt, hollow-eyed figures in grease-stained coveralls moved with the same exhausted shuffle. They were all ghosts of a sort, haunting the margins of the great machine. He unsealed the cargo bay of the Nereus, his hands sure and practiced. The haul was pathetic. A few dozen articulated joints from a pre-Hegemony cargo hauler, a spool of still viable fiber optic cabling, and the prize, a single turbine blade. Pitted with corrosion, but forged from a titanium alloy, the Hegemony no longer had the resources to manufacture in such quality. It was a pittance, a scrap, but it had to be enough. It always had to be enough. A Hegemony adjudication drone, a sleek, black teardrop of a machine floated silently to a stop beside him, its single red optic glowing with cold disinterest. The voice was synthesized, devoid of inflection, a perfect mirror of the system it served. Kael thumbed the manifest on his wrist-mounted datapad, transmitting it with a flicker of his eyes. The drone's optic pulsed as it processed the data. He leaned against the hull of his submersible, the cold metal of familiar comfort, and watched it begin the scan. The drone's manipulator arms extended, delicate and precise, bathing each piece of salvage in a multi-spectrum light. It was looking for microfractures, molecular degradation, radiation contamination, any excuse to devalue his labor. It was part of the game. You brought up the past, and the Hegemony told you how worthless it was before melting it down to build their future. His gaze drifted past the drone, up toward the vaulted ceiling of the docking bay, where a massive holoscreen flickered. It was an ad perpetually running for the Martian Colonial Initiative. A sun-drenched family, their faces models of Aryan perfection, laughed as they stood on a balcony, overlooking the crimson plains of Mars. The sky behind them was a brilliant, impossible blue, a terraformed sky. The slogan materialized in calm, serene script: Mars, a new horizon, a reward for contribution. The lie was so beautiful, it was almost seductive. It wasn't a reward, it was an escape valve. A pressure release for a world packed to the gills with desperate, hungry people. Contribute enough, sacrifice enough, feed the machine enough, and you too could win the lottery. You could leave the teeming, choking arcologies of Earth and breathe real air under a new sun. The screen showed pristine cities under shimmering biodomes, lush fields of genetically engineered crops, and children, so many clean, healthy children, running on actual grass. It was a vision of heaven broadcast into the heart of hell, and everyone bought it. It was the only hope they were sold. The drone intoned, its optic fixing on him. It floated away without another word, a silent black judge, delivering its verdict and leaving him to face the sentence. Kael pushed himself off the Nereus, his joints protesting. Level 12. The journey itself was a descent into a different kind of pressure. The transit tube hissed open into the main concourse, and the full sensory onslaught of the arcology hit him like a physical blow. The air was a thick soup of smells, savory, yeast, heavy nutrient, paste from a dozen humming dispensers. The sharp ammonia of industrial cleaning agents failing to mask the underlying odor of unwashed humanity. The ozone sting of overloaded electrical conduits. It was the smell of a billion lives lived on top of one another. A human terrarium slowly running out of oxygen. The noise was a constant, deafening roar. 100,000 conversations in a dozen languages. The rhythmic tramp of Hegemony enforcer boots on the permacrete floor. The relentless, upbeat jingles of corporate advertising bleeding from holoscreens on every vertical surface. Towering over it all was the voice of the Hegemony, a calm, reassuring baritone that echoed from unseen speakers, delivering the day's production quotas and reminding everyone that their individual contribution was the key to collective prosperity. A stronger hegemony is a safer humanity. Do your part. Kael moved through the throng. A ghost in the machine. He kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, making himself smaller. The crowd was a river of bodies, a torrent of desperation. Faces were pale under the artificial lights, etched with fatigue and anxiety. They were the cogs, the fuel, the biomass that kept the arcology running. They scurried from habitat block to manufactory floor, their eyes fixed on the promise of another cycle, another day of standard rights. The right to breathe this recycled air, to drink this reclaimed water, to eat this synthetic food. The right to exist. He saw the subtle caste system in the clothes people wore. The drab-gray jumpsuits of the general labor pool, the slightly better cut blue of the technicians, the crisp black uniforms of the low-level bureaucrats. And then there were the uncycled, the non-citizens, marked by their tattered clothes and the desperate, haunted look in their eyes. They flitted through the crowds like wraiths, begging, stealing, doing whatever it took to survive outside the system that had discarded them. Kael felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He was one bad haul, one mechanical failure, one miscalculation away from joining them. The Cinder Margin. That's what the old salvagers called it, the razor-thin line between contributing and being ash. He passed a recruitment poster, a 10-foot-tall hologram of a soldier in gleaming power armor. A plasma rifle held at the ready. The soldier's jaw was firm, his eyes full of righteous fury, and behind him, a swarm of monstrous, insectoid creatures. The official rendering of the xenomorphids was being obliterated in a storm of golden light. Your species needs you. Enlist today and secure humanity's future on 2 worlds. He snorted, the sound lost in the din. He'd seen the real war, the one they didn't put on the posters. He'd seen what those things did to human bodies. He'd seen the fear in the eyes of real soldiers, not the chiseled-jawed models they used for propaganda. The memory was a shard of glass in his gut. The lift to level 12 was a cramped, vibrating box that smelled of stale sweat and disinfectant. He pressed himself into a corner, trying to ignore the press of bodies. The lift chimed at each level, the doors opening to reveal another identical corridor, another slice of the same monotonous, controlled existence. Level 12 was different. The air here was cleaner, the light brighter. The floors were polished, not stained. The drone of the lower levels was replaced by a low, reverent hum. This was the level of bureaucracy, the domain of the functionaries who kept the great machine's ledgers. The central adjudication hall was a vast, sterile chamber, cold and white. Rows of identical cubicles stretched into the distance, each one manned by a bored-looking official in a starched, gray uniform. There was no sound here but the soft tapping of styluses on datapads and the gentle, almost musical chime of the credit system. It was a temple dedicated to the god of numbers. His designation number flashed above cubicle 113. He walked the length of the hall, his heavy sea boots sounding unnaturally loud on the pristine floor. The woman in the cubicle didn't look up when he arrived. She had a severe face, hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. Her nameplate read, Adjudicator, T-451. Not a name, a model number. Voss, Kaelen, 7, Gamma -3, he said, his voice raw from disuse. She tapped her datapad. Without a word, the drone's report materialized as a hologram between them. Kael's meager hull was rendered in crisp, three-dimensional detail. He watched her eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, flick over the data. He knew what she was seeing. The microscopic pitting on the turbine blade, the slight signal degradation in the fiber optic cable, the trace amounts of pre-hegemony industrial contaminants embedded in the alloy of the articulated joints. Imperfections. Excuses, the turbine blade, he started. His voice a low gravel. That's pre-collapse, a grade titanium. The purity is over 99%. You can't synthesize that anymore. The purity is 99.47%. She corrected, her voice flat, emotionless. However, deep pressure corrosion has compromised its structural integrity by a factor of 12%. It's high-grade scrap, nothing more. Its contribution value is adjusted accordingly. She tapped the screen. The projected value of the blade plummeted. Kael felt his jaw tighten. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears, a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the sterile silence of the hall. He kept his hands clenched into fists at his sides, forcing himself to remain still. Getting angry was a luxury he couldn't afford. It was a black mark on your record, a sign of instability, unsuitability for the contribution cycle. The cabling, he pressed, his voice strained. There's over 100 meters there, fully intact. Signal fidelity is at 89% of optimal. She droned, not looking at him. Standard hegemony protocols require a minimum of 95% for reintegration into the primary grid. It will have to be stripped and re-spooled. Labor costs will be deducted from the raw material value. Another tap, another chunk of his earnings vanished into the ether. He watched the numbers, the cold, hard digits that represented 36 hours of his life, spent in a metal coffin. 1,000 atmospheres below the sun. It was a slow, methodical vivisection. She was cutting him apart, piece by piece, with the passionless precision of a surgeon. This is less than half the standard valuation, he said, the words tasting like metal. For the first time, she looked up at him. Her eyes were empty of sympathy, of anything resembling human connection. They were the eyes of the machine she served. Standard valuation applies to standard quality salvage, 7. Gamma, -3. Your hull is substandard. The system is not emotional. It is mathematical. It is fair. Fair. The word hung in the air between them. A perfect, crystalline absurdity. There was nothing fair about a system that owned the air you breathed and charged you for it. Nothing fair about a world where the scraps of a better past were the only currency for a miserable future. She made her final tap on the datapad. The final tally glowed in the air. He stared at it, his stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. It was just enough. Barely. After deducting his life support fees for the cycle, his rations allocation, the energy cost for recharging the Nereus, and the docking tariff, he would be left with a credit balance that was almost zero. He had treaded water. He had spent his life, his health, and his time, and all he had bought himself was the privilege of doing it all over again. He hadn't gained an inch of ground. He hadn't slipped back. He was trapped in perfect, agonizing stasis. "Do you accept the adjudication?" the woman asked, her voice a sterile prompt. There was no choice. To refuse was to default on his debts. To refuse was to become uncycled. "I accept," he choked out, the words feeling like a confession of defeat. The message flashed in the air and then vanished, along with his hopes. Adjudicator T, -451, had already turned back to her datapad. Dismissing him from her reality, he was a closed file, a completed transaction. He turned and walked away, the sound of his own footsteps echoing the hollowness inside him. He felt the eyes of the other functionaries on his back, a weight of silent, collective judgment. He didn't look at them, he just walked. Back in the concourse, the noise and the smells seemed even more oppressive than before. He made his way to a nutrient dispenser, his movements stiff and robotic. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. The machine whirred, recognized his now pauperized credit balance, and ejected a small gray brick of protein paste into the receptacle. It was the cheapest ration available, tasting vaguely of cardboard and desperation. He leaned against a support column, unwrapping the paste with numb fingers. He took a bite. It was tasteless, gritty, but it was fuel. He had to eat. He had to sleep. He had to prepare the Nereus for another dive. The cycle had to continue. As he chewed the synthetic food, his eyes were drawn back to the massive holoscreen high above. The perfect smiling family on Mars was still there, their laughter silent amidst the cacophony. The brilliant blue sky behind them was a punch to the gut. The pressure of 1,000 atmospheres was nothing compared to the weight of that one lie. And he knew with a certainty that was as cold and as deep as the abyss he called his workplace, that he was drowning